Pattern making is an art. The art of manipulating and shaping a piece of fabric to conform to one or more curves of the human figure. It is the bridge between design and the realization of the designer's vision. If you want to learn how to make your own clothes, you will need to pin down the basics of pattern making. Just like any other skill, the basics are the foundation for expanding your knowledge and skills into something amazing. So with that being said, let's take a moment to fantasize about designing and making the wardrobe of your dreams. Hello and a warm welcome to Lesson 7 of your Diploma in Fashion Design. I am so glad you have decided to join me again, and I hope you are as excited as me to explore the fabulous world of fashion. I am so passionate about pattern making, so I am excited to start teaching. Our core learning objectives for today's lesson are looking at what pattern making is and the different pattern making techniques. We are also going to look at the different pattern making symbols that will help you to read a pattern successfully. At the end of the lesson, we will draft a few basic seam blocks. Before we start, let's look at what you will need in order to draft your basic block at the end of the lesson. You will need some paper. For this lesson, an A4 size will do, but in the later modules, the bigger the paper, the better. Grab a good pencil and don't forget the sharpener and eraser. Also grab a pen to write all the important information down. A ruler is a must. We will look at different rulers soon and a tracing wheel. If you don't have some of these tools yet, don't worry. It gives you the opportunity to be creative and think outside of the box. After all, pattern making is all about problem solving. Last but not least, you need a clean, flat surface to work on. A little tip as we start this lesson: a messy table translates into a messy pattern, and sometimes you can even see it in the final product. So, keep it clean so that you can really concentrate on the pattern of your design. I want to welcome all of you amazing designers to Lesson 7 titled For the Love of Patterns. I really do love pattern making, and I am excited to share that love and passion with you. The history of pattern making is actually really interesting, and I can talk about it for a while, but for the purpose of today, I am going to keep this short and sweet. To survive, human beings had to master the art of creating shelter and clothing, among other things. As time went on, we became better at those tasks and began to create a standard for what worked best and instructions on how to replicate the best results. That is the main function of a pattern, to act as a template for recreating a design that has already been created and, hopefully, perfected. For hundreds of years, fit was not considered particularly important when it came to clothing, but was largely utilitarian. Its main purpose was to cover and protect the body. As the concept of fashion advanced, fit began to emerge to make clothing more functional, comfortable, and create desired body shapes. Fitted clothing was thus considered a luxury only the wealthy could afford because they could hire tailors and dressmakers to custom sew garments. After the introduction of form-fitting clothing in the 13th century, the responsibility expanded from exclusively being the job of the women to include tailors and dressmakers. From the mid-14th century, tailors authored journals and books with cutting and clothing construction instructions. Years later, by the late 18th century, how-to books were published for the home dressmaker. Around 1840, full-size patterns were introduced and became very popular, establishing the commercial pattern industry that is still thriving today. Essentially, pattern making is the art of translating a designer's idea for a garment into a real piece of clothing that fits the body in a flattering way. It is the vehicle that allows the designer to reproduce the garment. A few simple techniques have been used in pattern making for centuries, but any technique that turns a design sketch into a real garment is valid in the world of pattern making. No matter the technique, the basics of pattern making remain the same, bringing the designer's dream to life. Patterns are developed in two primary ways. A drape pattern is developed from manipulating fabric directly on a person or a dress form. Draping is often used when the garment design or the selected fabric does not lend itself to drafting a pattern. A paper pattern is usually created from the drape pattern sections. A drafted pattern is based on the body measurements and often referred to as a flat pattern drafting. Drafting involves measurements of the body like the bust, waist, and hips, which are then marked on paper to create a foundation for the designer to build upon. This can be hand-drawn or it can be computer-generated, utilizing pattern-making software programs. In this course, we will use many flat pattern drafting principles and techniques to draft and manipulate the pattern. Just like cooking, it is hard to do the right job without the right tools. Can you imagine cutting a steak with a spoon? Just like any profession, a few specialized tools are handy when drafting a pattern and can make your life easier, so it is worth to invest in some quality items to help you out. To draft a pattern, a flat working surface is required. It is important to remember that a tracing wheel will mark the top of the surface, so some protection must be given to that surface. When you are pattern drafting, it is important to invest in a good ruler. I prefer using the see-through ones. Clear gridded rulers or metric rulers allow you to view the pattern while drafting. This is particularly handy when it comes to adding seam allowance. If you do not have a ruler like this yet, you can use a normal straight ruler, but it will make your job a little bit more difficult. Curved rulers provide excellent curvature for pattern drafting, especially for drawing side seams, sleeve lines, and hip curves. This is really nice because, guess what? The body is not straight. The whole body is a series of curves. French curves provide additional curvature. L-square or right angle rulers are convenient for drafting perpendicular lines. A tape measure is necessary for measuring both straight and curved lines and to take body measurements. There are several ways to draft patterns using pattern paper, tracing paper, tissue paper, and material. The advantage of using paper is that it is exact and does not stretch out of shape. If you do not have a piece of paper big enough, you can also draft on newspaper. Blocks often used are traced onto thin cardboard as it is more durable than paper. A calculator eliminates the hard work of calculating proportions and measurements and is more accurate. Some people work more efficiently when tools are comfortable in their hands. So try different tools like pencils and scissors until you find what you like. Paper scissors should be comfortable in your hand and allow you to cut accurately. A basic fashion design rule is to never mix scissors. Never use your fabric scissors to cut paper. Clear tape or glue is used for adding extra paper to patterns and making pattern adjustments. Pencils are used to make a precise and easy to read line. Unnecessary lines can also be easily erased when drafting in pencil. On that note, it is always important to have an eraser and pencil sharpener close by when drafting patterns. Color pencils or markers are used to indicate different pattern adjustments or to outline complicated areas. Pens are required to write all necessary pattern information, symbols, and instructions on the pattern. A red pen is usually used to create the grain line. An awl is used for making small holes in the pattern and fabric to mark details like darts. And a tracing wheel is used for transferring pattern shapes to another paper without cutting the original pattern. It can be very daunting to start a new hobby, learn a new skill, or grow your knowledge when you do not understand the terminology. We are going to discuss the common terms used in the pattern making industry. If you want to have a strong pattern making foundation, these are the terms to know. The arm sky is the armhole measurements. Balance points are marks that refer to notches that help align fabric pieces when constructing a garment. The bias is a line that intersects with the warp and the weft of a textile at a 45-degree angle. This is often used in draping when maximum stretch is needed. Blending is a process of shaping lines to create a smooth transition from one point to another. A pattern block is a simple pattern with no seam allowance and style lines, but provides consistent balance points and key measurements as a starting point for garment development. A block pattern is a foundation pattern and designers use it as the basis of their design. The basic fit of the design will conform to the block used even though style lines and other design details may have been added. Basic blocks can be drafted to fit individual figures by using your own measurements instead of the standard ones. We will look at constructing our own blocks in Module 3. The bust point is the furthest protruding point of the bust, in other words, the nipple. A dart is a wedge cut out in a pattern used to create shape. Darts are the basis of all pattern making as it converts the flat piece of paper or fabric into a three-dimensional form that fits the body. A dress form is a mannequin used during the pattern making and garment construction phase of design. Ease is the amount of space between the body and the garment and will determine how the garment fits in relation to the body. A loose-fitted garment will thus have more ease than a fitted garment. You also get negative ease, and this can only be done with stretch fabrics because the garment created is smaller than the body measurements. A lot of sportswear has negative ease. Before we continue with more terminology, here is a little fun fact for you guys. One of the first instances of a dress form can be traced back to ancient Egypt. When Howard Carter opened King Tut's tomb in 1923, he found a wooden dress form that was likely used to display the ruler's clothing. In fact, this dress form was made exactly to his measurements, making it a valuable piece of information and a significant milestone in the world of fashion. The fold line marks the edge of a pattern piece that is to be placed on the fold of the fabric. The folded edge will not have seam allowance as there will be a fold and no sewn seam. Grading is the increasing and decreasing of a size to fit a range of bodies. And the grain is the direction in which the yarn of a fabric is knitted or woven. The grain line on a pattern is an arrow showing you how to line up the fabric and the pattern pieces. Notches are triangular markings on the pattern used to match two corresponding pieces. It is standard for the front to have one notch and double notches for the back pattern pieces. So in the image you can see that that is a front pattern piece. And then a pattern piece is a section of the whole sewing pattern, each with various pattern symbols and information on it, which serves as a visual guide of what needs to be done with each pattern piece. If you are planning on drafting a shirt, you will have the following sections: a front, a back yoke, of course your sleeves, a cuff, a placket, your collar stand, and your collar fall, and then if you want, a patch pocket. A prototype is an example of a garment in its final fabrication. This is a sample of the final garment and not a mock for fit and design purposes. The seam allowance is the allotted fabric beyond the pattern for stitching the garment together. Simply put, a seam joins two pieces of fabric just enough to cover the raw edges of the fabric. The amount of seam allowance used varies depending on type of seam and the designer. The selvage is the finished edge of the fabric lengthwise. Slashing and spreading is a technique used to add fullness to a pattern by cutting it apart and spreading the pieces to make the pattern bigger. We will play with this technique later in the course. Your working pattern is the base used when creating new designs. This is the pattern that you manipulate. I know that was a lot to take in, but these terms are really important to understand before moving on, so good job for sticking it out. Ideally, a pattern maker would include all the sewing instructions for a garment's construction on the pattern so that anyone would know how to sew it. Although this would be the perfect scenario, due to limited time and space on actual pattern, symbols and abbreviations are typically used for convenience. First, let us look at the pattern abbreviations and then we will move on to the pattern symbols. I know this slide looks a little bit boring compared to the other ones, but please bear with me, it'll be a quick one. These are the most common abbreviations used in pattern making. So we have B, which is bust. W is for waist. H is short for hip. SHL is shoulder. CF is center front. CB is center back, of course. AH or AS is the armhole or arm sky. And then double S stands for side seam. SA stands for seam allowance. The following abbreviations are to describe different balance points or lines. I will also show you which line it is on the image. First, we have the chest line. As you can see, it runs across the chest. Then we have the bust line. The waistline is the smallest part of your torso, and the hip is the opposite. It is the widest part of your bum. And then we have our knee line. As you can see, there are many other lines like high hip, low hip, high waist, and elbow lines, but the ones you see on screen are the ones we use the most. And then we have some more abbreviations. BP is your bust point. HPS or SNP is your high point of shoulder or shoulder neck point. Your LPS or STP is your low point of shoulder or shoulder tip point. FNP is your front neck point, and BNP your back neck point. Let's place the abbreviation. So let's look at the little image, which is an example of a dress pattern. Here we can see the bust line and bust point. Then we have the waistline, the hip line, and the side seam. We also have the center front and the center back. Here we can see the high point of the shoulder and the low point of the shoulder, and then the front neck point and back neck point. Symbols are little golden nuggets of information on a pattern that will help the person making the garment understand the designer's vision. The finished line is a solid, hard line which indicates the outline of the pattern. A guideline is softer and can be considered process lines. The facing is a line that is broken and it indicates a different pattern piece. If you see a fold line on a pattern, that tells you that that piece should be placed on the fold of your fabric. A grain line will help the designer line the pattern up with all the other pieces and with the fabric grain. And an ease line can indicate ease, obviously, or it can indicate a certain amount that needs to be gathered. The cutting line indicates where the designer should cut, mostly used when spreading the pattern and adding volume. A pleat is indicated by a broken line and an arrow showing the direction the pleat must fall. And then we know what a dart is, but now we know what a dart looks like on a pattern too. It's a little wedge. Drill holes are indicated by a circle, and a notch is a triangle shape. When drafting a pattern, the following information, along with the important symbols, should be added to each pattern piece to avoid confusion and create consistency across pattern pieces. First, we have the size of the pattern. So, who can tell me what the size of this pattern is? This is the size. It is an M and it stands for medium. We are all used to different sizing systems like small, medium or large, 6, 8 or 10, 32, 34, 36, so use the one that you feel more comfortable with. Then we have the name of the pattern. What is the name of this pattern? The name of the pattern is usually what the garment will be called and referred to in ads or on the hanger tags and on the business system. In this case, the name of the pattern is the Daydream Dress. The name is up to you, the designer. You can be as specific as a mini tent dress or be more poetic like me. Then we need to add the name of the pattern piece. The name of the pattern piece is important for the cutter and the seamstress. This will indicate which part of the garment it is. As you can see, this is the center front top of the dress. Next, you have to include your cutting instructions. Sometimes your pattern will tell you to cut the piece out twice to create a symmetrical pair. Other times, a pattern will have a fold line instead. Examples of where you will often find a place on fold symbol will be on a center front shirt or skirt and a collar. How many times does this pattern piece have to be cut out? Twice, because it says cut times 2. This dress has a center front seam. If I didn't want the seam, I can always take away the seam allowance at the center front and cut it on fold. We also have to include the pattern piece number. It is important to know how many pieces a pattern consists out of to keep track of what has been cut out and what not. I always write it like this, so I know this pattern has 4 pieces and this front, top, center front piece is pattern piece 1 out of 4. Please also pay attention to all of the other important information like the pattern symbols. As you can see, we have our bus point marked with a drill hole, our notches to indicate the darts, the armhole and the side seam, and the very important, hard to miss red grain line. I know we have gone through quite a bit now, and it is overwhelming to have all these terms and symbols thrown your way. Please don't be too worried, and remember that all the summary notes and slides are available in your toolkit for you to refer to. I suggest you look at these to help you with your Module 1 assignment, which is 1 lesson away. If you plan on making a cake, you have probably Googled a few recipes and also watched a few YouTube videos, right? You have also probably spent some time tasting different cakes. Same goes with patterns. A great way to gain understanding on how patterns are made is to study existing patterns. I suggest you buy 1 or a few patterns and study them. Look at how they are shaped, how the curves move around the body, and the markings and information that appear on the pattern. If you have, you probably know how much information is packed into those small packages. From the type of pattern, the actual pattern, the materials needed, and the instructions can be difficult to read and understand if you don't know how. But don't have a pattern panic attack. After this lesson, you will be able to read and follow the pattern instructions like a pro. The good thing is that you get a lot of information to work with, from written and illustrated instruction to tips and guidelines. We are going to discuss some tips for deciphering your board pattern. We will look at all the different elements and information in more detail so that you can feel more confident about reading a sewing pattern. On the front of the envelope, you will often see several style variations of the same project, which we call views. These different views give you a little more creative freedom during the construction process. The back of the pattern has everything you need to know about the material, like the material type and the amount needed and notions needed. It will also show you the sizing of the pattern and measurements. Some nice tips are to pay attention to the measurements rather than the size, because brands all have different sizes. This will tell you how much fabric you will need. Each different view is identified by a symbol, typically a letter. The symbol is used in charts and the pattern to identify information about the specific view. Use the fabric suggested unless you know exactly what the properties are of the fabric you have in mind and how it will affect the design of the garment. and also pay attention to the notions needed. These include items such as the size and number of buttons, hooks and eyes, zips, any tools, and so on. It is best to read all the instructions before you begin. It will include important information like the details of the pattern, cutting and marking instructions, layout suggestions, alteration guidelines, pattern symbols, and images. Instruction tips include to look at the key and the glossary if you are unsure of the markings on the pattern pieces. The pattern layout shows you how to lay your pattern out for each view. The pattern pieces, as you see in the image, are labeled by number, which will come in handy when you work with them as it will match the number on the pattern. It will also tell you which pattern pieces to use for which view. Step-by-step instructions are written in various degrees of clarity depending on your construction knowledge. Please find the one that makes the most sense to you. The pattern is usually printed on a large piece of tissue paper. Pay close attention to the symbols and marks on the pattern before you start. You will notice there are many lines on your pattern, usually overlapping at quite a few places. The image is a good example of that. Different types of lines, like dotted or dot then dash, or varying dash lengths, are assigned to various sizes. The size you have chosen, cut that line for all the pattern pieces. The juicy pattern tips are to pay close attention to the lines on the pattern and only cut out the size you want the garment to be. Also pay close attention to all the symbols on the pattern. Are you ready for me to tell you about the next lesson? I always love this part because I get so excited. The next lesson will be a fun, practical lesson where you will be introduced to the humble sewing machine. We are going to create some basic seam patterns now that you will sew in the next lesson. That means that you need to buy some fabric and dust off that sewing machine. If you don't have a sewing machine yet, don't worry. The lesson will still be fun and valuable as you will learn how to sew for when you eventually get your hands on your future best friend. That is right, your sewing machine will become your best friend. Now we know enough to be able to create our own patterns. Let's look at the pattern making process from beginning to end. Two big decisions are made when beginning to draft a pattern from a block. They are block selection and fabric selection. As mentioned in the previous lesson, designers must acquire an understanding of the qualities of fabric and must understand the basic properties like the weight and the stretch of fabric and how it will perform. These properties will affect how a pattern will be cut and the outcome of the final design. 3 different patterns are used by designers when pattern drafting. These are: the block pattern is the basic pattern that is used as a basis for all adaptations. The block pattern is traced onto paper to produce the working pattern. Select the correct block for the design. For example, will it be a close or easy fitting block? Will it have an inset sleeve or kimono sleeve? Don't worry too much about this. We will look at this in the next module. The working pattern is used when adding basic style lines and design details. Pattern sections are traced and may be further adapted. Complicated designs may need several alterations and trials at this stage of the process. Here you will look at and decide the length of the design, style lines, and adding volume by cutting and spreading the pattern. The final pattern is the pattern from which the garment is made. The pattern must be clearly marked with all the necessary pattern information and construction instructions. It should also include seam allowance, pattern symbols like notches, grain lines, and drill holes, and your pattern information, which includes the pattern size, pattern name, pattern piece name, cutting instructions, and the pattern piece number. When a designer completes a design, fabric ratings are used so that an accurate costing can be produced. The rating refers to the amount of fabric used to create the design. Costing is very important. Therefore, economical layouts ensure you get the best result with the most efficient use of your fabric. The layout rating will be based on your fabric's width and how much of the length you used. The finished pattern is then made up into a mock out of calico or grige fabric to check the shape, fit, and proportions. If there are no alterations needed, the sample is created. A sample, often referred to as a prototype, is when the design is cut out of the final fabric and constructed. If pattern and design meets the designer's or the client's or the buyer's vision, then the pattern is graded into the sizes required. So, now that your pattern size is created and perfected, what now? Do you really need to do all of that over again to create an additional size? No, of course not. Pattern grading is used to adjust your base pattern size to create other sizes. There are many ways of doing this, but it comes down to the same end result, that is, that you have a consistent visual across all sizes. Being a designer is not all fun and games. The production process, especially the pattern making phase, can be a complex and time-consuming process. But if you have a positive attitude and if you are eager to learn, you will find the joy in this phase. Today we are going to draft a few patterns you will use for your next lesson, so get your pencil and paper ready. We are going to draft 3 basic patterns. One will be how to add a hem, the other will be a straight seam or style line, and the last one a curved style line. This is the time to experiment and get used to writing the pattern information on the pieces and adding pattern symbols and adding seam allowance. But first, let's look at how to trace your pattern. Tracing instead of cutting a pattern is recommended and encouraged to preserve the original pattern to refer to at a later stage if necessary. To trace your working pattern, place the pattern on top of a piece of blank paper and use your tracing wheel to trace the pattern pieces and all the necessary symbols, balance points, and grain lines. Some handy tips: if you are tracing a complicated pattern, highlight the different pattern pieces with different colors. Do not move your pattern while you are tracing it, and use a pencil to join the dots of the traced pattern piece to create the pieces on the paper. After you have traced your pattern, transferred all the information and symbols, you can now add your seam allowance. But how do I do this? First, decide on your desired seam allowance and keep it consistent throughout all the pattern pieces. Use that amount and make little marks along the final line of your pattern, which will be the stitching line on the garment. Repeat at regular intervals and join these with a ruler. A quick tip: for curved areas, draw marks at shorter intervals and join it with a curved ruler or freehand. Our first block is the hem block. Please refer to the image when you are recreating the pattern yourself. Also note that some designers work in centimeters and some in inches. There is no wrong way, because working in centimeters are a bit easier to some. I'm using it in my blocks, but the inches are in the brackets. Also, feel free to convert the centimeters to inches yourself. Okay, let's look at our first step. A to B is 16 centimeters. A to C is 24 centimeters. So your basic block is 16 by 24 centimeters. C to D is 2 centimeters, and that is your hem allowance. Remember to add in all the important detail. So you can see that this is the hem block, it is a sample block. I only need to cut it once and it is only one pattern piece. The straight seam or straight style line block is next. So A to B will be 8 centimeters. A to C, 16. So we are creating a line in the middle of the block because 8 plus 8 equals 16 centimeters. A to D is 24 centimeters. So exactly the same as the previous block, 16 by 24 centimeters. And then we add our 2 centimeter hem allowance D to E. Again, add in all the information after it has been traced. So here you can see that I have split the pattern into 2 pieces to create the seam in the middle. I've also added all the information and the pattern symbols. So you can see that this is the straight seam pattern. I've called one side 1, the other is side 2, and I only have to cut each pattern once. Side 1 is my pattern number 1 of 2, and side 2 is pattern 2 of 2. And together they make one pattern. The last seam is the curved seam or curved style line. Let's look at the steps. So A to B is 8 centimeters, A to C 16 centimeters. So exactly the same as the previous block, but we've created a curved style line instead of a straight one. A to D is again 24 centimeters and D to E 2 centimeter hem allowance. As you can see, I've traced and added my information, pattern symbols and seam allowance. If you do not have a tracing tool yet, you can always print these examples out. It will be in your summary notes. You can then cut on the lines, paste each piece on a blank page and then add seam allowance. Or, because this will fit on an A4 page, trace it the same way we've traced our fashion figures by placing the blank page over the printed example and placing it against a window. Unfortunately, this will only work for this lesson because these blocks are small. Creating patterns for clothing is a skilled practice. At the initial phase, it is difficult and time-consuming to learn pattern making, but once you understand the basics, it becomes interesting and quite a creative stage of the design process. Understanding the basics will also provide insight into how a garment will take shape. It is important to embrace this as it will, without a doubt, make you a better and more creative and successful designer. I'm going to leave you with this quote, and it says, "Sucking at something is the first step of being really great at something." You probably know by now what your challenge is. You need to create the 3 basic blocks discussed for your next lesson. These are the hem block, straight seam, and curved seam blocks. Please remember to include all the necessary information like the pattern name, cutting instructions, and pattern piece number. Also add all the important pattern symbols like your notches, your grain lines, and your seam allowance. Take a photo of your pattern or of you drafting your pattern and share it on your favorite social media channel, our Show Academy Facebook group, and don't forget to tag Show Academy. Please use the Show Fashion Pattern hashtag. I look forward to seeing all of your patterns. Please don't get too frustrated. Pattern making is not easy and it will take some time getting used to, but you are doing great and I believe that all of you will get the hang of it. I didn't like pattern making when I started my design career and now it is one of my favorite things to do. At Show Academy, we believe in the philosophy, your future, your way. We build our courses around you, the student, to suit your lifestyle, whether you are a hobbyist, a professional, or an entrepreneur. As you can see, we tailor our courses to suit your needs. If you have enjoyed Module 1, just wait until we start Module 2. It is going to get better in every way, shape, and dress form. You see what I did there? I have great news for you guys. Your Lesson 1 of Module 2 starts next week. And look at that. We are done with Lesson 7. One lesson away from finishing the first module of your course. Guys, I am so proud of all of you. It is not easy to do what you are doing, but if you push through, stay motivated, work hard, and stay dedicated, I am sure all of you will become amazing, successful fashion designers. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really love having all of you in my virtual classroom and seeing all of your work you post. I hope to see all of you back for Lesson 8 titled Ready, Steady, Sew. Until next time, as always, stay fashionable.